The sound of the key turning was sharper than any scream. It cut through the silence of the house and echoed inside the small room like the final stroke of a gavel. In that instant, the world collapsed into four walls. The metallic click carried a message more brutal than words. You are no longer free, and the one holding the power is the very person you once carried in your arms. Darkness swallowed the space, and the air seemed to thicken, as if even the atmosphere refused to offer comfort. She stood still for a moment, unable to comprehend how a son, her son, could turn a simple lock into a weapon of control. Her eyes tried to adjust to the dim light seeping through the cracks, but what she truly struggled to adjust to was the betrayal. Betrayal does not arrive like a sudden storm. It comes slowly, disguised as silence, until it reveals itself with a cruelty that makes breathing painful. She remembered when that same boy, now standing outside with laughter dripping from his lips, once begged her not to leave his side at night because the shadows in his room frightened him. Now he was the shadow, and she was the one trapped. The first minutes stretched endlessly, time twisting itself like a cruel trickster. Hunger was not yet the problem, but fear had already dug its claws into her chest. Fear is never just the absence of freedom. It is the presence of imagination. Her mind painted images of what could come next. Would he return with threats, or would the silence itself be the punishment? The uncertainty was worse than the lock. Human beings can endure many forms of suffering, but the unknown gnaws in a way that leaves invisible scars. She pressed her hand against the wooden door, not as if expecting it to give way, but to feel something solid under her palm. The rough surface grounded her, reminded her that she was still real, still present. In moments of captivity, small gestures become rituals of survival. A person counts the scratches on the wall, listens for the distant hum of life beyond the room, clings to the smallest sounds as proof that the world outside has not completely vanished. She thought she could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a faint and familiar sound that once symbolized routine. Now, it became a reminder that life continued, indifferent to her suffering. The laughter from outside had faded, but it left an echo inside her mind. That laugh was not joyous. It was sharp, almost rehearsed, as if he wanted her to know that this was not a moment of anger, but of deliberate power. The cruelty of premeditation weighs differently than impulsive rage. One is fire, consuming quickly; the other is ice, freezing slowly, preserving the pain for longer. She realized with horror that this was ice. Her thoughts raced back to moments when discipline had been part of their relationship. Times when she told him to clean his room, to respect his elders, to study harder. She remembered the stubborn look in his eyes even then, the flicker of defiance that she dismissed as normal adolescence. But adolescence passes. This was not rebellion. This was domination, a twisted inversion where the child grows into an oppressor and the parent becomes the silenced victim. The walls seemed closer with each passing second. Confinement does not need chains or ropes. It is enough to know that the handle cannot turn from your side. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her body trembling less from the cold and more from the realization that she had lost the invisible thread that ties authority between mother and child. Once broken, that thread does not mend easily. She whispered a prayer under her breath, not so much for rescue, but to anchor her thoughts. People underestimate the power of words spoken in solitude. A prayer, a song, even a line of poetry murmured into the void can become a lifeline when no one else is listening. She thought of mothers across the world who might have felt similar despair. History is filled with stories of parents betrayed by those they raised. Empires have crumbled because of sons who turned against their fathers. Legends often describe the betrayal of rulers, but rarely the betrayal inside a simple home. Yet for her, this betrayal was greater than any fall of kings. The minutes became heavier. Each creak of the house felt amplified. The ticking of a clock in another room sounded like mockery. She thought about food, about how many hours she might go without it. But then another realization struck her. Hunger was a tool, not an accident. He had told her with chilling calmness, "No food until you learn obedience." Hunger was now a leash, meant to bend her will. She closed her eyes and remembered his childhood face smeared with chocolate, the little hands that once reached for her with absolute trust. That memory clashed violently with the reality of the locked door. It was like holding two photographs of the same person, one filled with innocence and the other with cruelty, and trying to believe they belonged to the same soul. Her breathing grew heavier, not from panic, but from the weight of questions that had no answers. How does love transform into control? How does gratitude become contempt? The mind struggles to find logic, but sometimes cruelty has no reason. It thrives in the cracks of power, waiting for the moment when one discovers that another is vulnerable. She leaned against the wall, listening. Outside, the world continued, and inside, she began to map the boundaries of her new reality. Every square inch of the room became significant. The corner where the light barely touched, the bed that felt more like a cage than a place of rest, the window too small to offer escape. Survival in captivity begins with recognition of space. She was already calculating, already resisting in ways too subtle for anyone to notice. Her body ached, but her spirit fought to stay upright. Pain has a curious effect on the human heart. For some, it crushes. For others, it awakens something ancient, a voice that whispers, "You will not be broken." As she sat in the dark, she realized she was entering a battle, not just with her son, but with herself. Would she let fear carve her into silence, or would she rise inside, even if no one could see it yet? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what part resonated the most with you. Don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss another story like this. The hours inside the room did not pass like ordinary hours. They stretched, folded, and twisted until they lost all shape. Darkness became a living presence, pressing against her skin, crawling into her thoughts, whispering that time itself was dissolving. At first, she tried to measure the minutes by her own breath, steady and slow, counting as if she could control the rhythm of captivity. But soon her chest tightened, and each breath felt like a stone rolling uphill. The absence of light made every sound sharper. The creak of wood, the faint rush of air through a gap in the window. Even the beating of her own heart became overwhelming. Darkness has its own language, and it speaks to the imagination. She began to see shapes that were not there, faces that vanished as soon as she blinked. The mind, deprived of vision, paints its own cruel pictures. Sometimes it gave her the illusion of safety, as if someone sat beside her whispering comfort. At other times it mocked her, with the outline of shadows moving against the wall when nothing moved at all. Scientists who have studied isolation describe how quickly the brain begins to invent companions, enemies, or even entire landscapes when stripped of sensory input. She was experiencing that truth in its rawest form. The hunger started like a gentle tug, a reminder that the body needed care. But as the hours dragged on, it sharpened into a claw. The stomach growled not in anger, but in despair, folding in on itself. She pressed her hand against her abdomen as if she could soothe it, whispering words of comfort that belonged to no one but her. There is a cruel irony in a mother starving at the hand of the child she once fed. The very same hands that had once accepted warm meals were now withholding food as punishment. The cycle of nourishment, once sacred, was twisted into a weapon. Her throat dried, each swallow more difficult than the last. Even saliva seemed to abandon her. She thought of water, clear and cold, flowing from the faucet she had used every day without a second thought. It is often in deprivation that humans understand the depth of ordinary blessings. A glass of water, a slice of bread, a ray of sunlight on the floor. Captivity strips life of its excess and reveals how fragile survival really is. She stood and tried to pace, but the room was too small to allow release. The darkness made her stumble, so she stretched her arms to find the boundaries, feeling the cold walls like blind explorers once felt the edges of unknown caves. Each step became a negotiation between fear and determination. The room became not only a prison, but also a mirror reflecting her weakness and her endurance. Memories began to fill the silence. The sound of her son's first laugh, so pure and bright, echoed in her mind against the backdrop of his cruel laughter earlier. She remembered his small footsteps running through the hallway, calling for her when he had scraped his knee. That voice, once sweet, now sounded harsh and commanding. These memories came uninvited, and each one carried the sting of betrayal. It is easier to endure cruelty from a stranger than from someone whose life you gave shape to. The hours bent into each other. Was it night or still day? The absence of light dissolved any sense of order. She realized that her mind was drifting in and out of clarity. In some moments, she was fully aware of her surroundings, cataloging every detail of the room. In others, her thoughts slipped into half-dreams where voices of the past spoke to her. She heard her own mother's advice about patience. She heard lullabies long forgotten. She heard fragments of arguments that had shaped her life. The brain, when trapped, reaches into the archive of memory for company. The silence was broken at times by faint sounds outside the door. A floorboard creaking, perhaps his footsteps, perhaps nothing at all. Each sound carried with it the weight of anticipation. Would the door open? Would he bring food? Or would it remain shut, reminding her that she was no longer in control? Anticipation is its own form of torment, a slow tightening of the rope that never snaps but never loosens. At one point, she thought she heard him chuckle again, but she could not be certain. Perhaps it was memory echoing louder than reality. That uncertainty gnawed at her because it meant her mind was no longer a trustworthy ally. She needed clarity, yet clarity slipped further away the longer the darkness reigned. She sat back down, wrapping her arms around herself, feeling the tremors running through her body. The body remembers suffering long after the moment passes, storing fear in the muscles, teaching them to flinch at shadows. She closed her eyes, though the room was already blind, and tried to imagine light. She pictured sunlight entering through the window, dust floating lazily in the beams. She pictured herself walking to the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, cutting bread, buttering it slowly, savoring each bite. This imagination became a form of survival. Hope does not always arrive like a loud declaration. Sometimes it is a fragile vision of normal life that keeps a person from breaking. The bed felt harder as the hours went on, no longer a place of rest, but a reminder of confinement. The sheets smelled faintly of detergent, an ordinary smell that now carried with it a strange comfort. Even small traces of the ordinary felt like lifelines. She clung to them, repeating silently to herself that if she could endure this night, she could endure the next. The darkness was relentless, but within it, she discovered an unexpected truth. Fear had not silenced her entirely. Beneath the hunger, beneath the thirst, beneath the exhaustion, there was a quiet defiance. It was not yet loud or strong, but it existed. The body could be starved, the mind could be shaken, but something deeper whispered insistently that she was not finished. And as she pressed her hand once again against the cold wall, she realized the hours of silence had carved out not only pain, but also the first fragile outline of resistance. We'd love to hear your reflections on this journey. Drop a comment with your thoughts and experiences, and make sure to hit subscribe to stay connected with more stories of resilience and courage. The memories came without permission, flowing into her mind like water slipping through cracks. In the suffocating silence of the locked room, she could not escape them. She saw herself years earlier, cradling him when he was still small enough to fit against her chest. She remembered the smell of baby powder, the tiny socks she would carefully fold, the nights when she would sit awake through fevers, whispering lullabies until his breathing calmed. Every detail felt cruel now because it clashed violently with the reality of the man outside the door, the one who laughed while she starved. It was as if her past had been stolen, rewritten, and thrown back in her face. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear his first words, that stuttering attempt at calling her name. The pride she had felt then was immense, as though the universe itself had handed her a secret treasure. She had believed she was raising someone who would one day carry her values into the world. She had sacrificed her comfort so that he could grow strong. The act of preparing food, tucking him into bed, and saving money for his needs had been done without hesitation. That is the role of a mother, to give without counting. Yet here she was, locked in the dark by the same hands that once clung to her for safety. The inversion of roles was unbearable. The one she had nurtured was now the one inflicting punishment. It was as if the universe had flipped itself inside out. She had once held authority, the guiding figure shaping a child's life. But now authority had been ripped from her, and the child had reshaped himself into something unrecognizable. Psychologists often speak of cycles of control, how power shifts can create dangerous dynamics inside families. But hearing about such things in theory is very different from living them. She was not a case study. She was a woman watching her history turn into a weapon against her. She thought about the dinners she had cooked, how he always demanded the biggest piece of meat, and how she would give it without complaint. She thought of his school years, when she had worked extra hours to buy supplies and clothes so he would not feel ashamed in front of other children. The countless sacrifices that went unnoticed now returned in sharp contrast to his deliberate cruelty. It was not only the lock on the door that cut her, it was the realization that every act of love had been thrown into a void. The bitterness of the reversal deepened as she considered how society views parenthood. Mothers are supposed to be untouchable in the eyes of their children, symbols of safety and unconditional support. Yet the very person meant to be her protector in old age had turned into her captor. There is a particular sting in betrayal by one's own blood. When a stranger harms you, it is violence. When your child harms you, it is annihilation. The room around her became a stage where every memory replayed. She could almost see the shadow of her younger self moving through the same space, carrying laundry baskets, cleaning, preparing meals, calling her son to the table. Now that same space mocked her with its emptiness. The walls knew her as a mother, and now they knew her as a prisoner. The continuity of life had been snapped in two, leaving her floating between what once was and what now crushed her. Her mind wandered further, seeking explanations. She remembered times when he had shown small signs of cruelty, moments she brushed aside. A slammed door, a refusal to say thank you, the way his eyes sometimes flashed with defiance when she corrected him. She had told herself he would grow out of it, that adolescence was a storm that would pass. Parents often cling to hope, believing their children will eventually find their way. But hope can sometimes blind as much as it guides. She wondered if she had ignored the warnings, if she had unknowingly raised the very man who now punished her with hunger and silence. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the scent of dust, but what suffocated her most was this collision between past and present. The boy she had once kissed goodnight now held the keys. The child who had once hidden behind her legs when frightened now used fear as a tool. It was a cruel irony that made her chest tighten until she thought she could no longer breathe. In the stillness, she considered the idea of motherhood itself. It is often described as unconditional, as if the bond between mother and child cannot be broken by circumstance or choice. But what happens when that bond becomes a chain used for punishment? What happens when the nurturer is forced to confront the nurtured as an enemy? These questions pressed against her heart with a weight she could not set down. Yet even as the despair threatened to consume her, there was a flicker of defiance. Love, twisted and bruised, was still inside her. It reminded her of who she had been before the lock turned. She was not simply a victim. She was the woman who had once carried another life through sleepless nights, who had faced the exhaustion of sacrifice and chosen to give more. That history could not be erased, even if he tried to rewrite it with cruelty. It lived inside her, stitched into every memory and every scar. She pressed her hands together tightly, feeling the pulse in her wrists, grounding herself. The pain of betrayal was immense, but it carried with it a strange strength. The contrast between the child she remembered and the man he had become sharpened her awareness. If he could transform, then so could she. And in the silence of the locked room, she began to realize that the story of power between them was not yet finished. Violence inside a home is rarely loud enough for the world to notice. It does not always leave visible bruises or broken furniture. Sometimes it comes in the shape of silence, the quiet locking of a door, the absence of food, the humiliation whispered instead of shouted. For her, it was not fists that struck, but the metallic sound of a key turning, the darkness pressing against her body, and the deliberate withholding of care from the very person who owed his existence to her. This was not the violence of strangers in the street or enemies from afar. This was the violence that grows in the hidden corners of family, where outsiders imagine only love resides. She realized that society is comfortable with certain stories of abuse. People speak of husbands who harm wives or of parents who mistreat children. These narratives are recognized, discussed, and sometimes even supported with laws and shelters. But who speaks of the mother locked away by her own son? That story is harder to believe, too unsettling for polite conversations. It is easier for neighbors and relatives to pretend they do not see, and so the violence remains invisible, buried beneath appearances of a normal household. The world does not suspect a thing because the aggressor is not the figure they expect. As she sat in the dark, she thought about the masks families wear. At gatherings, smiles stretch across faces, plates of food are passed, and stories are shared. The son who now held her captive once sat beside her at those tables, charming relatives with his polite words, helping carry chairs as if he were dependable. Nobody would imagine that same young man laughing while his mother cried behind a locked door. This is the cruelty of hidden violence. It thrives under the cover of normality. She remembered the last time she attended church, sitting quietly while the sermon spoke about honoring one's parents. She had nodded with the congregation, never imagining that the commandment would be so deeply violated in her own life. Religious texts, cultural traditions, even folk tales all speak of the sacred bond between mother and child. That bond is supposed to be unbreakable, a thread of respect woven through generations. But reality is more complicated than stories. History is filled with accounts of betrayal inside families. Ancient rulers were poisoned by their heirs, kings were dethroned by their sons, and parents were abandoned when they became too weak to provide. Violence against parents is not new, but it is rarely spoken of because it makes us question the very foundation of family. She thought of her neighbors, who might hear her muffled cries and dismiss them as ordinary disputes. Perhaps they thought it was just a mother and son arguing, the kind of thing every household experiences. People prefer explanations that do not disturb their peace. The idea of a son tormenting his mother is so unbearable that denial becomes easier than recognition. This denial is what allows silent violence to continue unchecked. The hunger gnawed at her stomach, but the realization gnawed deeper at her soul. This was not just a personal betrayal. It was also a reflection of a larger silence in society. Who would believe her if she told them? Would they accuse her of exaggerating, of misunderstanding his intentions? Many victims of hidden abuse face this wall of doubt. Their stories are too uncomfortable, so the world questions them instead of confronting the cruelty. The locked room became not just a cell, but also a symbol of how her suffering could be dismissed. Her thoughts wandered to the idea of home itself. For most people, home is a place of safety, a sanctuary where the world cannot intrude. Yet for her, home had become the very site of terror. It is a terrible paradox to be endangered in the place that should protect you. This is why silent violence is so devastating. It destroys the sense of safety not only in the body, but in the soul. When the sanctuary becomes the prison, where does one go for refuge? She leaned against the cold wall, listening again for footsteps. There were none, only silence, heavy and unyielding. Silence can wound more than noise because it forces the mind to fill the emptiness with fear. Every second felt like proof that her suffering was intentional, designed not just to punish, but to erase her sense of worth. Violence without noise becomes violence without witnesses, and violence without witnesses becomes violence without accountability. She wondered how many others lived behind closed doors in similar agony. How many parents sat in dark rooms across the world, hiding their tears, because admitting the truth would shatter the illusion of family. Perhaps the numbers were larger than anyone dared to count. Pain is often multiplied in silence, carried in secret, disguised behind routine greetings and polite smiles. The hidden epidemic of abuse remains invisible precisely because it happens where no one is willing to look. The betrayal was not only in the act of being locked away, but in the knowledge that the world outside continued as usual. Somewhere people laughed, televisions played, meals were cooked, and life went on. Yet inside her small cell, life had been reduced to shadows and hunger. The contrast was unbearable, but even in that contrast, she began to feel something shift. If the world would not bear witness, then she would. If no one else would acknowledge the violence, she would name it silently within herself. Recognition was the first step to reclaiming dignity. Her heart pounded in the quiet, not only from fear, but from a growing awareness. What she was experiencing was not only darkness, but revelation. The world hides countless untold stories of mothers betrayed, and now she carried one of them in her body. She pressed her palms against the floor, steadying herself as if anchoring her existence against the weight of invisibility. Though no one outside could see her pain, she refused to let it disappear into nothingness. Her suffering was real, and her will to endure was beginning to rise against it. Join the conversation by leaving a comment about what stood out to you in this story. Subscribe to the channel to follow along with more powerful and inspiring narratives every week. She screamed until her throat burned, her voice echoing against the walls only to be swallowed by the silence outside. Each cry was desperate, heavy with both fear and hope, yet nothing came back. No footsteps approaching, no voices asking if she was all right, no hand knocking at the door to break the unbearable stillness. The realization crept in slowly but firmly that her neighbors must have heard something. Sound travels easily through thin walls and wooden floors, especially in houses pressed closely together. They must have heard, but they chose to ignore. That was the cruelest part. The quiet indifference of others is its own form of violence. People prefer not to see what unsettles them. They close windows when they hear shouting, turn up the volume of the television when cries for help disturb the comfort of their evening. It is easier to believe that nothing serious is happening than to admit that someone you know is suffering only a few steps away. Studies of urban life show that people are less likely to intervene when many others could also act, a phenomenon called the bystander effect. Responsibility becomes diluted. Everyone assumes someone else will do something, and in the end, no one does. She was discovering that truth in real time, and it deepened her isolation. Her mind wandered to her relatives. Surely they wondered why she had not answered their messages or why she had not visited in weeks. Yet even family, bound by blood, often looks away when faced with uncomfortable truths. Families know how to excuse silence, inventing explanations that protect them from shame. Perhaps they thought she needed rest. Perhaps they assumed she and her son were having disagreements, the kind that eventually resolve on their own. That kind of convenient denial allowed them to sleep soundly while she lay locked in the dark. She pressed her palms against the door until her skin stung, as though she could push her despair through the wood and force someone to feel it. But the world outside remained unmoved. It was then she realized that suffering in silence is not only imposed by the aggressor, but also maintained by the passivity of everyone else. The chain does not consist only of a lock and key. It is strengthened by each person who chooses to ignore. Her mind drifted back to childhood stories where communities rallied around each other, where neighbors knocked on doors to share bread or to check if someone was unwell. Those tales belonged to another time. The modern world, she thought, often celebrates connection through screens while neglecting real human presence. It is possible to have hundreds of virtual friends and yet not a single neighbor willing to help when a cry escapes from behind a door. The thought chilled her, because it revealed not only her own abandonment, but the larger loneliness of society. Even so, she could not stop wondering if at least one person had paused when they heard her cries. Maybe an elderly neighbor, sitting by a window, had tilted their head and frowned. Maybe a child playing outside had asked what that noise was, only to be told to hush and keep playing. Perhaps for a fleeting second, her suffering had pierced the daily routines of others, before being buried again under convenience. The idea that her pain had brushed against another's awareness but had not been acted upon hurt almost as much as the lock itself. She thought of the role of shame in silencing victims. If someone did suspect what was happening, would they even dare to speak? Admitting that a son could imprison his mother was so unthinkable that people would rather dismiss the possibility than face it. Shame protects the aggressor and imprisons the victim twice, once with the lock and once with secrecy. She felt as though her life had become invisible, not because no one could see, but because no one wanted to. The hunger gnawed at her body, but the deeper hunger was for acknowledgement. Human beings can endure immense pain if they know someone else sees them, if they know they are not alone. But isolation magnifies suffering into something unbearable. She whispered to herself to keep from losing the sense of her own existence. Her voice, faint and raspy, became proof that she had not disappeared entirely. In moments of despair, self-recognition becomes a form of rebellion. Time continued its slow, merciless crawl. She lay against the doorframe, eyes swollen, ears straining for even the smallest sign that someone outside cared. But the house was silent, the street beyond calm, life continuing as if nothing were happening within these walls. That was the greatest cruelty of all, that the world could stand so close and yet remain so far. Her heart ached with the knowledge that invisibility is the deepest wound of abuse. Pain inflicted in secret thrives because others refuse to look. She realized that no one might come, not today, not tomorrow. If there was going to be any witness to what she endured, it would have to be herself. That awareness settled over her like a weight, but within that weight was also the seed of defiance. She could not count on neighbors or relatives or passers-by to free her. She could only count on the strength buried inside her body and her memory. The silence of the outside world pressed in like an accomplice, but she clenched her hands together and refused to let despair fully consume her. Even in abandonment, she discovered that survival begins with the stubborn act of refusing to disappear. And as she sat once more in the stillness, her mind sharpened with the clarity that being ignored was as dangerous as being locked away. And yet even this realization did not erase the faint ember that told her she was still alive and still capable of resisting. His voice came first as a murmur through the wood, low and deliberate, and then sharper, each word landing like a slap against her ears. He told her she would not eat until she learned to obey. The cruelty was not in the threat itself, but in the calm certainty with which he spoke it. Hunger was not an accident. It was a sentence, calculated and precise. For centuries, those who wished to dominate others have used food as a weapon. Armies have starved entire cities into submission. Rulers have withheld bread to remind people who held the power. Prisons have broken spirits by controlling the smallest scraps of sustenance. Now that history echoed within a simple home, where a son turned a kitchen into an armory and a locked door into a fortress. She pressed her hands against her stomach, already tight and aching, and realized that his punishment was designed to reach deeper than her body. Hunger is not only physical, it seeps into the mind, clouding thought, breaking concentration, wearing down the will until surrender seems easier than resistance. He wanted to train her into silence, to mold her as if she were not his mother, but a subject, a prisoner of war, a person whose very dignity could be bent by deprivation. The manipulation was relentless because it fed on memory as much as on absence. Each time her stomach cried out, she remembered how many meals she had prepared for him. Countless evenings bent over the stove, measuring spices with care, tasting sauces to make sure they were perfect, slicing bread just the way he liked it. She had fed him when he was too young to hold a spoon, spooning broth into his mouth while rocking him on her lap. Those memories now turned poisonous because the bond of food, once sacred, had been corrupted into punishment. There is something unbearably cruel in the reversal of nourishment into deprivation. She tried to reason with herself, whispering that she could endure hunger for a time, that her body was stronger than this. But his voice came back through the door, mocking her, telling her she would break sooner than she thought. He knew, as all abusers know, that words can wound more deeply than fists. The language of control lingers long after the bruises fade. Victims of psychological violence often recall exact phrases decades later, etched into their minds as scars no one can see. His words carved themselves into her thoughts, repeating like a chant, pressing her toward submission. It was not only the denial of food that crushed her, but the humiliation built into it. The act of saying "you will eat only when I allow" reduces a human being to an animal waiting for scraps. It strips away individuality and leaves only obedience as a condition for survival. She could feel the trap tightening, her identity as a mother, a woman, a person being reduced to whether or not she would kneel to his demand. The manipulation spread beyond the hunger. He would let her hear him moving outside the door, sometimes whistling, sometimes laughing softly to himself. These sounds were not random. They were reminders of his freedom, his comfort, his access to what she was denied. The scent of food drifted faintly under the door when he cooked for himself, taunting her body with what it could not have. This was a calculated performance, a theater of control staged within her own home. Psychologists often note that the most effective forms of psychological abuse are not explosive, but systematic. The abuser creates a rhythm of deprivation and reward, punishment and relief, until the victim begins to anticipate and mold themselves to avoid suffering. It is a training of the spirit, as cruel as any physical chain. She realized with horror that this was exactly what he intended. The hunger was not random. It was training. He was shaping her silence as if she were clay under his hands. Her mind fought back with fragments of wisdom gathered over a lifetime. She remembered hearing stories of prisoners who survived by clinging to inner worlds, of captives who recited poems silently, who imagined banquets so vividly that their bodies forgot for a moment the ache of starvation. She closed her eyes and tried to picture a kitchen full of bread rising in the oven, butter melting, steam rising from bowls of soup. The mind can be a sanctuary when the body is punished. Yet even as she pictured these things, the sound of his mocking voice would return, tearing through her fragile refuge. The humiliation deepened when she remembered how society often dismisses psychological abuse. If she told someone that her son had hit her, they might gasp, express outrage, call for justice. But if she told them he locked her in a room without food, many would shrug, call it an argument, suggest she was exaggerating. Emotional and psychological wounds are harder to measure, and because of that, the world often treats them as less real. But sitting in the dark, with her body shaking from hunger, she knew this form of abuse was devastating in its precision. It was not wild or uncontrolled. It was cold, deliberate cruelty. She pressed her forehead to the door, listening for any sign that he might relent, but only silence met her. That silence carried its own message. He wanted her to wait, to hope, to feel the slow disintegration of her will until the word obedience slipped from her lips like surrender. Yet inside the pain, she felt a spark of fury. The hunger was real, the weakness undeniable, but her spirit whispered that her worth was not his to measure. Her obedience could not be purchased with starvation. Her body trembled, her lips cracked, her mind clouded, but she clung to the thought that surviving this was itself an act of resistance. If he wanted to break her, then every moment she endured without yielding was proof that she remained unbroken. And though her body begged for food, her heart began to understand that the truest form of nourishment was the refusal to give away the last piece of herself. Memories have a way of slipping in uninvited when silence becomes unbearable. In the darkness of that locked room, she could not keep them away. They rose from the corners of her mind, vivid and piercing, painting scenes of a life that seemed almost like a dream now. She saw him as a toddler, clumsy legs carrying him toward her with unsteady steps, arms outstretched for balance until he fell into her lap. She remembered the way his hair smelled faintly of milk and soap, how his cheeks were warm against her skin, how his eyes lit up when she entered the room. Those memories had once been a source of comfort, proof that love had existed, that motherhood had meaning. Now they became knives that cut deeper with every detail. She thought of the nights she spent sitting by his bed, holding a damp cloth to his forehead when fever burned through him. He would shiver and whimper, and she would whisper promises that everything would be all right. She remembered how small his hand felt in hers, clutching with desperate trust, believing without question that she would never let him go. That trust had been sacred. To betray it was not just cruel, it was unthinkable. Yet here she was, locked away by the very person whose life she had once guarded like a treasure. The memories poured in relentlessly. His first day of school, when he clung to her dress, refusing to let go until she promised she would be waiting when the bell rang. The way he smiled when he saw her again that afternoon, running across the playground as though the hours apart had been unbearable. She remembered how proud she was when teachers told her he was bright, how her chest swelled when other parents complimented his manners. It was easy then to believe that all her sacrifices were worth it, that the sleepless nights and endless labor would one day bear fruit in a son who would honor her. But now, those same images became twisted reminders of what she had lost. Each memory mocked her, whispering that the love she had poured into him had not been enough to keep him kind. This is the cruelty of memory. It does not only recall joy, it contrasts joy with the present pain, making the wound deeper. Scientists say that memories are not fixed photographs, but living, changing impressions. Each time we recall them, we alter them slightly, tie them to new emotions. She could feel that happening now. Those once warm images of feeding him, of soothing him, were being stained by the reality of her captivity. The boy with chocolate smeared across his lips was now the man who withheld food from her. She remembered birthdays, the cakes she baked even when money was scarce, the way she would blow out the last candle herself because he was too excited to stop at one breath. She remembered Christmas mornings, wrapping gifts late into the night so that he would believe in magic. She remembered his laughter as he tore through the paper, his cries of delight as he discovered toys he had begged for. The effort she had poured into creating joy for him now replayed like a cruel joke. The boy who had once looked at her with gratitude now looked at her as an object to control. Her eyes filled with tears, but not only from sadness. There was anger too, sharp and heavy. Anger at herself for being blinded by love. Anger at him for twisting that love into power. She asked herself whether she had missed the signs, whether she had excused behaviors that hinted at this cruelty long ago. But then another thought rose. Maybe the love had always been genuine, and something inside him had changed, something she could never have prevented. The human heart is a mystery, and even the deepest bonds can be corrupted by greed, resentment, or a thirst for control. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold the memories still, to stop them from cutting so deeply. But they kept coming. She saw him at 12, excited after scoring a goal in a school game, looking for her in the crowd and beaming when he found her clapping. She remembered the quiet evenings when he would curl beside her on the couch, resting his head on her shoulder as they watched television together. Those small moments, once ordinary, now felt like fragile relics of a world that no longer existed. The ache of these recollections grew heavier than the hunger. Hunger gnawed at the body, but memory gnawed at the soul. She realized that what made this torment so unbearable was not only the lock or the deprivation. It was the contrast between what had been and what was now. The human mind seeks continuity, a thread that makes sense of past and present. But here, the thread had been violently severed. There was no logic, no bridge that could explain how the boy who once whispered "I love you" before sleep was now the man who whispered that she must learn obedience. She pressed her forehead against her knees, rocking slightly, a motion instinctive to those in despair. Rocking is something mothers do for their children, a rhythm that calms. Now she rocked herself, as if she could become her own caretaker in the absence of compassion. In that moment, she understood something profound. She could no longer rely on the child she had raised to be her source of comfort. She would have to become her own anchor, her own voice of reassurance, her own protector. The memories still hurt, but they also carried an unintended strength. They reminded her of her capacity to give, to endure, to survive for the sake of another. That same strength, twisted now by betrayal, could be reclaimed. If she had been capable of holding life together through poverty, through illness, through sleepless nights, then she was capable of holding herself together through this. The past, though painful, was also proof of resilience. She raised her head slowly, tears drying on her cheeks, and allowed herself to breathe with intention. Each inhale carried fragments of the past. Each exhale carried the determination to keep going. The boy she once loved might have turned into her tormentor, but the mother who had loved him remained. And in the silence of the room, she began to realize that the same love that once sustained him could now sustain her, not as a bond between them, but as a reminder of her own unbroken capacity to endure. Her body was weakening, but something inside her refused to follow. Hunger had hollowed out her stomach, thirst had made her lips crack, and exhaustion had turned her limbs into lead. Yet beneath that weight, a pulse of defiance throbbed steadily. She began to sense that surviving was no longer just about staying alive, but about preserving the last piece of herself that could not be taken. The walls could confine her body, but not her will. This realization came slowly, not as a burst of inspiration, but as a steady, quiet awareness that built itself inside the silence. She started to practice small rituals to keep her mind from collapsing. Counting her breaths became a rhythm, a way to mark time when there were no clocks. She whispered fragments of prayers, poems, and old sayings she had learned as a girl. She repeated the names of the people she had loved, each name like a bead on an invisible rosary. These acts seemed small, but they were acts of resistance. Psychologists studying prisoners of war have found that such mental routines can be lifelines, giving shape to days that would otherwise dissolve into despair. She was not consciously following a strategy. Her instincts as a survivor led her there. When her thoughts threatened to spiral into panic, she imagined opening a window onto sunlight. She pictured herself walking outside, breathing fresh air, feeling the warmth of the earth under her feet. She recreated the smell of coffee in the morning, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of birds at dawn. These visions did not erase her suffering, but gave her moments of reprieve, like taking sips of water in a desert. The mind, she discovered, could be a refuge even when the body was trapped. Her hunger sharpened her senses rather than dulling them. She became aware of every creak in the wood, every shift in the air. She could smell faint traces of food outside the door, and instead of letting the scent torment her, she used it as a reminder that the world beyond the room still existed. That world was not a dream. It was waiting, and she intended to return to it. This focus transformed her from a passive victim into an active presence, even in confinement. The pain of betrayal still cut through her, but she began to examine it differently. She saw her son not only as the aggressor, but as a person twisted by his own darkness, a darkness she could not fix or feed anymore. This shift in perception allowed her to stop blaming herself for his cruelty. She understood that her survival now depended on separating her identity from his actions. She was not defined by what he was doing to her. She was defined by how she would respond. She began to move slowly around the room, feeling the walls, mapping the space like an animal learning its terrain. Each corner became familiar, each texture memorized. By mastering the small world she was forced into, she created a sense of control. Even if the door remained locked, she could claim authority over what was inside. This small mental shift gave her strength. Anthropologists describe how people in captivity carve hidden marks or repeat secret gestures to assert their existence. She did not carve marks, but she drew invisible lines in her mind, reminding herself that she was still there. In the midst of weakness, she noticed her breathing deepen. It was as if her body was recalibrating, conserving energy, focusing on survival. She found herself humming softly, an old tune she had once sung to her son when he was small. The melody floated in the air like a thread tying her to her former self. The irony was painful, but the act of humming also soothed her. Music, even in fragments, has been shown to lower stress and anchor memory. She clung to that knowledge without thinking, letting the sound vibrate in her chest until she felt a flicker of calm. There were moments when despair clawed at her, whispering that she would not make it through. But she met those whispers with a new voice rising inside, a voice that said she had endured harder things than she had ever spoken about. She remembered working long shifts while raising him alone, walking home late at night through dangerous streets, facing illnesses without support, pushing through fear because she had no choice. Those memories, once heavy, now became evidence. They proved she had survived before and could survive again. Her body trembled, but her eyes grew steadier. She realized that her strength was not a shield, but a quiet persistence. It was not dramatic or visible. It was the kind of strength that stays when everything else is stripped away. This understanding settled over her like a cloak. She was still afraid, but fear no longer ruled her. She began to sense that even in captivity, she was becoming something different, someone she had not known she could be. In the stillness of that room, she felt the shape of her spirit changing. It was no longer just a mother suffering at the hands of her son. It was a woman rediscovering her own core, her own capacity to endure, her own right to exist beyond the role she had been given. That realization was not loud. It was quiet and steady, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. And as she sat in the darkness, feeling both the ache of her body and the flicker of her resolve, she understood that her will to live had shifted from instinct to choice. The moment of quiet defiance arrived without warning. She had been trapped in darkness for what felt like endless hours, the hunger gnawing at her body, the silence pressing against her mind, and yet a spark deep inside refused to die. It was not courage as one imagines it in stories of heroes, nor was it an epiphany. It was the subtle recognition that she had endured all that life had demanded before, that she had survived poverty, illness, long nights of worry, and countless disappointments. If she could survive those trials, she could survive this. Survival became an act of deliberate choice, not a response to external threats. She moved carefully, testing the space around her with hands outstretched, tracing the contours of walls, the edges of furniture, and the corners of the room as if she were learning the geography of her own confinement. Anthropologists and psychologists have observed that captives in isolation often create mental maps, memorizing every detail of their surroundings to regain a sense of control. That is what she was doing unconsciously. Each touch, each small discovery of the space became a claim of authority over what she had been told was not hers to command. Her breathing became her anchor. Inhaling slowly, exhaling fully, she felt each heartbeat, each pulse, each tremor in her limbs as proof that she still existed. The mind can falter when the body is weak, but the body remains, and awareness of its presence can become a lifeline. Ancient texts and survival manuals often stress the importance of grounding oneself in the body when the mind is threatened by fear. She had never needed those teachings in theory before, but now they were alive inside her, guiding her through each trembling moment. The darkened room, once oppressive, began to feel less like a trap and more like a stage where she could observe herself. She noticed the subtle patterns of light filtering under the door, the minute changes in the air as someone moved beyond the threshold, the faint creak of floorboards. Sensory awareness sharpened in captivity. Her perception of time, space, and sound became acute in ways it had never been before. She realized that while her son held the key to her physical confinement, he could not reach into the mental sanctuary she was building. Hunger was still present, sharp and demanding, but she began to treat it as another obstacle to endure rather than a force that could subdue her. Throughout history, humans have learned to manipulate the perception of hunger to gain control, as seen in survival training, wartime sieges, and psychological experiments. She understood instinctively that he was employing the same method, deprivation as dominance. Awareness of this pattern gave her a form of resistance, a way to contextualize the pain so it no longer ruled her entirely. Her thoughts drifted back to her past roles as nurturer and protector. She remembered holding him through storms of childhood fear, tending to scrapes and fevers, and standing over him when he could not face the world alone. Those same acts had once defined her identity. Now, they were memories she carried inward, using them not to lament what was lost, but to remind herself of the resilience that had enabled those acts in the first place. Strength could be reclaimed from memory. She whispered fragments of poetry to herself, words she had once read or recited to calm herself and others. The sound of her own voice, even in the darkness, became a lifeline. Recitation and repetition have long been used by people in isolation to maintain mental stability. Prisoners of war, explorers, and even monks in long periods of solitude have relied on this technique to create order and continuity. She had no training in psychology, but instinctively, she had discovered the same method. Each syllable she whispered reinforced her sense of self, building a quiet fortress around her mind. Her anger began to crystallize into focus. Not the kind of furious, uncontrolled rage that can consume, but a deliberate, precise awareness of injustice. She acknowledged the cruelty of the act, the intentional malice in the withholding of sustenance, the power he held, and the silence of the world outside. Recognition of injustice is a key stage in reclaiming agency. By naming the act for what it was, she refused to absorb it silently. The emotional labor of witnessing cruelty while retaining self-awareness became a form of empowerment. Even as exhaustion pressed heavily against her limbs, she realized that endurance was layered. Physical endurance was only the beginning. Mental endurance was forged through observation, memory, and focus. Emotional endurance was carved from the acknowledgement of betrayal without surrendering the self to despair. She had spent her life cultivating resilience, often without naming it, and now she was calling upon it deliberately. She began to pace slowly, small steps against the worn floor, marking the rhythm of her presence. Each step was a statement. I am here. I exist. I will continue. Movement became ritual. The smallest acts, unremarkable in freedom, became affirmations of self in captivity. Anthropologists studying solitary confinement have noted that pacing, stretching, and repetitive physical actions can stabilize both mind and body. She was unknowingly following this ancient logic, claiming territory within the limitations imposed upon her. Her attention turned to the ceiling, tracing the cracks in plaster with her eyes, imagining skies beyond this room, clouds moving with winds she could no longer feel. Imagination became her doorway. Throughout history, humans in confinement have used mental imagery to escape. Some paint entire landscapes in their minds, others replay conversations, and some reconstruct entire memories. She chose a mixture of all three, alternating between past joys and envisioned freedoms, creating a mental world that sustained her even when her physical world refused. As she paused to breathe, she realized that strength is not always loud. It is quiet, steady, and patient. It does not announce itself with fanfare, but exists in every deliberate action, in every intentional thought, in the refusal to allow despair to claim dominance. She felt that strength now, pulsing through her muscles, steadying her mind. Hunger, darkness, isolation, all remained, but they were no longer masters. They were conditions she acknowledged, survived, and, in some measure, began to master. Her body ached, her stomach demanded, her mind trembled with tension, yet the recognition of her own resilience blossomed in that space. Even without food or light or human witness, she discovered a kernel of power within herself that neither the lock on the door nor the cruelty outside could touch. Awareness of this inner strength shifted something in her chest. She felt her own presence more fully than she had in hours, perhaps even days. Survival had transformed from passive endurance to active engagement with herself. The silence continued, thick and persistent, but she was no longer swallowed by it. Her mind, sharpened by deprivation, focused on the contours of her existence, the rhythm of her breathing, the memories she carried. She understood, with a clarity born of struggle, that control over her spirit had not been taken. It could not be. And in that understanding, a seed of unyielding determination took root, quietly preparing her for everything that would follow. Her ears, attuned to every subtle shift, caught what she had been hoping for without even admitting it to herself. A faint creak from the hallway, almost imperceptible, made her freeze in place. It was not his step, she realized with a jolt, but something lighter, uncertain, hesitant. The kind of sound that belongs to someone who is not yet sure they want to be here. Someone who notices irregularities but is testing the waters before intervening. Her heart beat faster, each pulse a mixture of fear and hope. Was it a neighbor checking the door? A family member finally wondering why she had disappeared from ordinary life? The thought was intoxicating. She remembered studies in criminology and social psychology about bystander awareness. People often notice signs of distress, but hesitate to act due to fear of embarrassment, uncertainty, or the assumption that someone else will step in. It is called the bystander effect, and it has tragic consequences in cases of abuse and confinement. Yet she had learned to listen differently now, reading every minute sound, every hesitation, as a potential opening. Every faint noise carried the weight of possibility. Her body tensed, muscles coiled, as if preparing to act herself, even without an external hand to help. In captivity, instinct sharpens to an extraordinary degree. Ancient survival manuals describe how individuals in enclosed spaces, whether trapped by natural disasters or hostile environments, begin to detect subtle cues that the untrained eye would miss. Her ears, her skin, even the vibration of the floor beneath her became instruments of observation, allowing her to track movements she could not see. The idea that someone might have noticed her suffering brought a strange warmth to her chest, a fragile hope that perhaps the world outside had not entirely abandoned her. She began to imagine who it could be, a neighbor quietly peering through the window, making sure to remain hidden so as not to alert her son. A distant relative, suspicious after weeks of missed calls and unexplained absences. Maybe a passerby who had noticed a light left on that should have gone off, or a shadow moving oddly through the house. Human perception often catches what escapes attention in ordinary life, especially when a pattern of neglect or anomaly emerges. The door itself became the center of her focus. She studied the grain of the wood, the way the hinges creaked, the tiny gaps along the frame. Each imperfection was a potential signal, a point of vulnerability she could exploit if necessary. It reminded her of stories she had read about prisoners escaping impossible confinements, how every scratch, every uneven edge could become a lifeline when observed and understood. She had no tools, no plans yet, but awareness alone is the first step toward action. Her thoughts drifted to the people outside the room, the strangers in close proximity who might intervene. What would they see if they dared to peek inside? Would they recognize the danger? Studies of domestic abuse suggest that outsiders often see only fragments of the situation and misinterpret them as normal interactions. She hoped that whoever approached had the insight to interpret what she could not convey through muffled cries and locked doors. The urgency of communication pressed heavily upon her, yet she was powerless to act directly. She considered the psychology of observation in stressful circumstances. Humans are remarkably skilled at pattern recognition, even unconsciously. In emergency situations, small inconsistencies, repeated noises, or unusual stillness can trigger awareness. She listened for them, testing the space with her ears, imagining how her suffering might ripple outward if even one perceptive person noticed. The faintest sound, a floorboard creaking differently, a muted sigh, could serve as a signal that she existed, that she was in danger. Every detail of the room became magnified. The direction of light under the door, the subtle draft from the hallway, the smallest scent carried on the air. She catalogued them mentally, searching for patterns, searching for a clue that her presence was becoming known. Each moment of uncertainty was punctuated with heightened perception, sharpening her mind in ways forced by necessity. She felt simultaneously vulnerable and alert, prey and strategist, a duality that only those in extreme situations can understand. Hope, once abstract, now manifested as a tangible tension in her body. Each pause, each hesitant step outside the door resonated through the floor, signaling to her nervous system that she might not be alone. She could almost hear the thought process of the observer, questioning, testing, deciding whether to act. It was a reminder that human connection, even tentative or indirect, can penetrate isolation in ways more powerful than brute force. Her memory carried her back to times when she had been vigilant in protecting her son as a child. She had watched for subtle signs of illness, of fear, of discomfort, translating tiny cues into decisive action. That skill, once used for his safety, now trained her mind to perceive potential rescuers, to read intentions through sound, through hesitation, through the rhythm of movement beyond the walls. The reversal was bitter, but it honed her awareness. The room seemed to shrink and expand simultaneously, becoming a crucible for perception. Every sound, every vibration, every imperceptible change in the air held meaning. She realized that even without physical assistance, she could influence the outcome by remaining vigilant, by holding her presence steady, by signaling subtly through breath, through whispered noises, through shifts in her own body. Survival was no longer passive. It was active, continuous, and reliant on observation as much as endurance. In the intensity of that stillness, she understood the fragile intersection between awareness and action. Someone outside might have noticed. Someone outside might intervene. And even if they did not, the very act of being perceived transformed her captivity from complete isolation into a space threaded with potential. Each creak, each sound, each breath of hope became a strategic marker, a mental map of possibility. Her attention to detail became both armor and compass, guiding her through the dark hours with the knowledge that recognition, even distant or imperfect, had the power to shift her reality. The door finally moved. At first, it was only a faint shift, a subtle change in the sound of the lock that made her muscles tense and her breath catch. Her body, long accustomed to immobility, stiffened, and her mind raced to interpret every creak and scrape as a signal. She could not yet see who was there or why the door might be opening. For hours, she had lived in the realm of uncertainty, every second measured by small noises and imagined movements. Now the impossible was happening. The boundary of her prison was yielding. The click of the lock was louder than any sound she had heard before, amplified by expectation and disbelief. Her hand trembled as it instinctively reached toward the door, not to push it open, but to brace herself against the unknown. She had spent countless hours imagining rescue scenarios, visualizing interventions by neighbors, relatives, even strangers who might glimpse through a window. Reality, however, moved differently than imagination. The door opened with a cautious grace, a tension that suggested care rather than haste. The first rays of light spilled into the room, cutting through the shadows in narrow strips across the floor. Light has a peculiar way of restoring perception, not only illuminating space, but also revealing the mind's readiness to engage with the world once more. She squinted, adjusting her eyes to the brightness after days of darkness, each step of adjustment layered with awareness and anxiety. She felt her own heartbeat as if it were a drum signaling both relief and continued alertness. The figure outside was uncertain, hesitant. There was no shout, no sudden movement, no display of force. Intervention often works quietly, and she realized that subtlety could be life-saving. Social workers, law enforcement, and rescuers often emphasize discretion in crises because a sudden confrontation can provoke a dangerous reaction from the aggressor. She understood this now, seeing the person outside the room navigate with care, measuring each action to avoid escalating violence. The moment she saw the hand reaching for the doorknob, a strange mixture of fear and hope surged. Every muscle in her body coiled, ready to react, yet she also wanted to collapse, to let herself believe that rescue had come. The mind of someone held captive processes extremes simultaneously: instinct to flee, instinct to trust, instinct to fight, all intertwined with the recognition of vulnerability. Evolutionarily, humans have developed such acute perception in life-threatening situations, allowing them to read intent and prepare responses in milliseconds. She was living that phenomenon in real time. As the door swung open, she saw a face, a person who had noticed, who had acted, who had come close enough to pierce the isolation. Relief collided with residual fear, and she realized that the first step toward freedom was not only physical, but psychological. She had endured deprivation, darkness, and betrayal, yet the recognition by another human being reminded her that her existence mattered beyond the room. That acknowledgement, even brief, has been shown to dramatically improve the ability to endure captivity or extreme stress. Human perception validates survival in ways that pure endurance cannot. The air shifted, fresher, carrying scents she had longed for but thought absent from her world. Fresh air is a minor miracle in confinement, signaling the presence of movement and change. In stories of survival, captives describe the first inhalation of external air as overwhelmingly transformative, as if the body and mind recognize that barriers have begun to fall. She inhaled deeply, letting the oxygen fill her chest and, in a way, infuse her with renewed agency. Her eyes adjusted further, revealing the full presence of the person standing at the threshold. Relief was mixed with cautious appraisal. She had been trained by her suffering to observe the smallest cues, to measure intention in posture, in expression, in tone of voice. This awareness allowed her to assess that she was not in immediate danger. A rescuer's approach is often as important as the act of opening the door itself. Psychological studies have confirmed that victims of prolonged captivity often rely on subtle signals to decide when to trust and when to maintain defensive vigilance. Her body responded, trembling with energy she had not realized was still available. Survival instincts surged, directing muscles, coordinating breathing, creating readiness without conscious effort. She remembered times when she had faced illness, storms, or long nights alone with her son as a child. Those moments had required similar coordination of mind and body. Experience, memory, and the intensity of her current suffering merged to provide a renewed capacity to move, to act, and to reclaim her presence. The first step across the threshold was tentative, careful, almost ceremonial. She did not rush, yet each micro-movement was an assertion of self. Ancient survival accounts describe the first step taken after captivity as both literal and symbolic. The body begins to reconnect with the world, the mind begins to reintegrate, and the soul registers that endurance has succeeded. Every inch she moved toward freedom became a statement. She was present, she was unbroken, and she was reclaiming authority over her body and her life. Her eyes swept the room one last time before leaving, taking in the space that had been both prison and proving ground. Every scratch in the wall, every shadowed corner, every cold draft had contributed to a survival she now recognized as extraordinary. She carried the lessons of the room within her: acute awareness, patience, resilience, and the capacity to observe the smallest details for advantage. In this way, the room, though confining, had prepared her for the outside world in ways she had not anticipated. As the door fully opened and light filled her body, she realized that liberation was not only the act of a rescuer pushing the door, but also the culmination of her inner strength, vigilance, and will to endure. Physical release and psychological affirmation merged in that moment. Freedom had a shape she had longed for, but it was inseparable from the resilience cultivated in darkness, hunger, and isolation. Every breath she drew was a reclamation of space, a silent testimony to the endurance that had carried her this far. Even after the door had opened and the light spilled fully into the room, she did not immediately feel free. Freedom is never an instant sensation. It is a gradual realization, a process of reclaiming what was taken. Her body, still trembling from hunger and confinement, required time to remember that it could move without restriction. Each step she took across the threshold was heavy with history, each breath a reclamation of life she had fought to preserve in silence. The small muscles of her hands, her legs, even her jaw carried the memory of hours of restraint, and yet they moved with a new purpose, a quiet triumph over every limitation imposed upon her. Her mind wandered back through the days she had spent locked away, analyzing every moment, every sound, every shift in the air. The isolation had been cruel, but it had also revealed the depth of her resilience. Human beings possess an extraordinary capacity for endurance when stripped to essentials, a phenomenon studied in survival psychology. Prisoners, explorers trapped in caves, and survivors of natural disasters all describe a similar awakening. When all external control is removed, the inner self emerges sharper, more focused, more alert to possibilities that were invisible before. She realized now that her spirit had grown, not in spite of her suffering, but because of it. The world outside the room seemed different now, not merely because she had returned to it, but because she had re-entered it, transformed. Colors appeared more vivid, the air sharper, and sounds carried a clarity that had been dulled by days of sensory deprivation. Every detail, sunlight glinting off a window, the texture of the floor beneath her feet, the subtle noises of life beyond her home, became a reminder that she was not only alive, but conscious in her survival. Scientists studying long-term isolation note that perception after release often feels heightened, almost overwhelming, as the brain reacclimates to stimuli. She felt this intensely, aware of everything at once, yet grateful for it, because it reminded her that the world had continued even while she had been unseen. Her thoughts returned to the journey that had brought her here, the betrayal, the hunger, the silence, and the moments when she had relied solely on her inner strength. Each memory was a thread in the fabric of her endurance. What had been intended to break her had instead forged her into something more resilient. Every trial, every pang of hunger, Every hour spent listening for subtle sounds beyond the door had been a teacher, and she had absorbed its lessons with a focus born of necessity. She understood now that suffering, while painful, is also a crucible that reveals the unyielding capacity of the human spirit. Gratitude surfaced quietly within her, not only for her own strength, but for the glimmers of humanity outside that had noticed, that had acted, that had created the possibility of release. Even the smallest act of awareness, a hesitant step outside her door, had made all the difference. It was a reminder that no one truly survives alone. In every rescue story, every account of endurance, there are threads of connection, even if indirect, that sustain life in ways that are invisible until the moment of liberation. She paused to breathe deeply, feeling air fill her lungs and muscles relax in ways they had not in days. Each inhale was both relief and affirmation. She existed, she had persisted, she had not been erased. Every step forward, though small, was a victory, proof that resilience does not always announce itself loudly, but manifests in steady, deliberate acts of persistence. The room behind her, once a prison, had become a monument to what she had survived and what she could carry forward. As she walked, the weight of isolation lifted, replaced by a quiet reflection. She understood the paradox of her experience. In being deprived, she had discovered the depths of her capacity. In being trapped, she had found the contours of her freedom. This is a truth observed by many who endure prolonged confinement, from historical prisoners to modern survivors of captivity. Endurance teaches not only survival, but also self-awareness, patience, and the ability to measure courage in quiet increments rather than grand gestures. The final moments of reflection were gentle, almost ceremonial. She thought about her own story, the inner battles she had fought in silence, the moments when fear threatened to overpower reason, the victories small and invisible that had allowed her to survive. Gratitude expanded in her heart, for herself, for those who had noticed, for the resilience of the human spirit that persists even when the world seems indifferent. It was a gratitude born not of relief alone, but of acknowledgement of everything she had endured and everything she had preserved. With this awareness, she lifted her gaze to the world beyond her walls. The sunlight spilling into the room was no longer just illumination. It was a symbol of possibility, of life restored, and of the agency she had fought to reclaim. Every sound, every movement, every breath of fresh air reminded her that freedom was now not merely physical, but profoundly internal. The story she carried within her body and mind was proof that even in the darkest confinement, strength, resilience, and hope can thrive. She paused for a moment longer, savoring the quiet power of survival. Then she looked toward what lay ahead, feeling the momentum of her regained agency propelling her forward. This was not the end of her story, but a new beginning, filled with awareness, gratitude, and determination. In that awareness, she understood that the lessons learned in darkness would guide every step she took moving forward, shaping her life with a depth that only survival could grant. Thank you for witnessing her journey. If this story of endurance and resilience touched you, do not leave yet. On the screen before you, another story awaits, ready to carry you deeper into the remarkable human spirit. Click now to continue and discover the next chapter of survival, courage, and the unbreakable will that lives within us all.